The mere mention of the area brings back memories of blinding snowstorms, storms, and fog. In wintertime, the weather there changes especially frequently. A calm sea can suddenly rage with hurricane force. Typhoons are often born. There is a known case when, during a strong storm, a warship overturned and sank. Even in spring, when it gets a little warmer, there is a continuous fog over the sea. Despite the fact that the shortest route between Japan and the United States lies through the northern regions, they have never been the main theatre of war, due to the fact that there are only a few days a year suitable for the action of ships and aircraft. This is largely true of the operations of submarines and other small craft. When a submarine is travelling in the stormy conditions of the north, the glass on the bridge is broken by the pressure of the water. Steel reflectors were required to prevent such occurrences. The hands of the observers holding the binoculars are stiff with frost, and the icy wind penetrates through warm clothing to the very bones. Even in the underwater position, where there is no wind, being in a boat is like being in a steel tube, bathed in seawater whose temperature is always only slightly above freezing. It's like being trapped in a glacier, where you have to shiver despite the warm clothing that binds your movements when you have to wade through narrow passages. So life on a submarine operating in northern waters was not carefree. Unlike the crews of other warships, submarine crews leave most of their personal possessions ashore or on a floating base. Only the minimum number of things needed at sea are taken with them. Therefore, when submarines move from warm seas to northern seas, they have to enter their bases to equip their personnel with warm uniforms, which take up much more space in the boat than usual. For a submarine, this fact creates additional difficulties. The Japanese Navy was built with the expectation that it would have to operate primarily in the southern seas, and so the inevitable happened. When the situation changed, the equipment and uniforms needed for fleet operations in the far north were in short supply. One of the difficulties that submarines have to face is diving in stormy weather, due to the fact that the waves throw the submarine back to the surface. With a wave from the traverse, the roll reaches 40-50 deg, and the boat is unable to level off during the dive. This poses a certain danger, not to mention the unpleasant consequences caused by such a roll. The swell is usually already hardly noticeable at a depth of about 30 meters, but in a very strong storm the rocking can be felt even at a depth of 55 meters. Fog also creates difficulties, especially for navigators when you cannot see the bow of your own ship. Not even the special binoculars adopted by the Japanese Navy do not help. Inside the boat itself, the fog generates great dampness, condensed moisture drips and trickles down the hull. Just before the outbreak of war on November 25th to 30th, 1941, Japanese submarines in northern waters, including the new submarine I-26, conducted reconnaissance near Kiska Island, on the approaches to Dutch Harbour and in the Adda Strait. Submarines I-174 and I-175 arrived in northern waters after leaving Kwajalein Atoll in January 1942. These boats were intended for patrolling off Unalaska, Amukta, Atka and the approaches to Kiska Island. They returned to Japanese waters in the middle of February. In April-May 1942, the first squadron of 6 submarines under the command of Rear Admiral Yamazaki participated in the preparation of the capture of fortified points in the Aleutian Islands, patrolling in the above areas. These boats were assigned the main task of reconnaissance, using for this purpose daytime, when there was no fog, as well as light nights, since darkness lasted only 2 to 3 hours, in the vicinity of Kadiak Island. Kadiak submarine I-25 found a cruiser and 2 destroyers, and submarine I-26 found 2 heavy cruisers making the passage from the Gulf of Alaska to Seattle. The rest of the boats of the squadron reported the situation in the area of Dutch Harbour and other points, waiting for the strike of the main Japanese forces, which in June 1942 made a successful landing on Attu Island. Meanwhile, submarines I-25 and I-26 sank 1 enemy transport each. At the end of June, the first squadron of submarines returned to their bases in Japan. The first squadron was replaced by the second squadron, which consisted of 7 submarines. The squadron operated in northern waters until early August 1942. In June and July, especially thick fogs created very difficult conditions for the action of the boats. Despite this, in mid-July in the area south of Unimak Strait, submarine I-7 managed to sink an enemy transport. In the newly formed squadron of submarines, designed to operate in the northern latitudes, were included medium submarines of old construction type Roe, which at the beginning of the war were used in the southern regions. These boats were poorly suited to navigating in stormy weather in the northern seas. Nevertheless, they were assigned to the defense of Kaiska Island. At the beginning of August 1942, the submarines of the squadron went into position. Most of the commanders of these boats, together with me, were trained at special courses for submariners. We met in Yokosuka before they went to sea. Their mood was depressed, as everyone realized that in the conditions of northern storms the boats could simply fall apart. On August 28, 1942, one of our planes in the area of Nazan Bay, Atka Island, detected enemy ships, including one cruiser. Submarines and seaplanes were ordered to attack these ships. Submarines Row 61, Row 62 and Row 64 went to the area of Nazan Bay. On August 31st, the submarine Row 61, commanded by Lieutenant Tokutomi, penetrated the bay and torpedoed a floating hydroaviation base. After the attack, the boat managed to leave the bay in time, but unfortunately it was later overtaken and sunk by enemy destroyers and aircraft. The submarine Row 61 was a very old L4 type submarine that had been in operation since the First World War. This was the only time it had been used to attack the enemy. Other submarines also managed to penetrate the bay and fire torpedoes, but they also failed to escape the pursuit of enemy surface ships and aircraft. The older boats could not dive deeper than 40 meters, so they had very little hope of rescue once they were discovered. By way of explanation, it should be said that the danger zone of a depth bomb explosion, that is, the distance at which the explosion can damage the solid hull of a submarine and cause its sinking, extends from 18 to 23 meters. If the bomb fuse detonates at a depth of 28 meters, a boat following at a depth of 15 to 30 meters will be in the danger zone. Thus, with a maximum submergence depth of only 40 meters, the old Roe-type submarines were always vulnerable to depth bombs, and generally speaking, the condition of these boats was such that they were ready to collapse without the explosion of depth bombs. The slightest concussion was enough to destroy them. On September 28, 1942, the submarine Roe 65 was attacked from the air, submerged but could not surface, but most of the crew managed to escape. The remaining Roe-type submarines were soon forced to return to Japan for repairs, and our forces in the north were left without submarines. At the end of the year, 2 Type I submarines sent to the command of our forces in the north were assigned the task of preventing the enemy from building an airfield on Amchitka Island. However, stormy weather made it impossible to fulfill this task, and the submarines were forced to return to base. In February 1943, the submarine force in the north was increased by the arrival of boats I-31, I-168, I-169, and I-171. Despite storms and icy winds, the submarines persevered and continued to carry out cargo delivery missions and patrols until mid-March. On March 12, when the enemy began landing on Attu Island, a new replenishment consisting of 12 Type I submarines arrived. Before the arrival of these boats, the delivery of materials for the urgent completion of the construction of bases on Kaiska and Attu Islands was planned to be carried out by transport. However, the enemy strongly hindered this operation, and after 2 unsuccessful attempts, transport had to be replaced by submarines. For this purpose, 7 submarines were engaged. On May 12, 1943, the enemy landed on Attu Island, so submarines I-7, I-31, I-34 and I-35 were hastily sent to the area. The next day at 13 HRs, 30 Min. In the area of Haruto submarine, I-31 torpedoed an enemy warship. In addition, it damaged another ship of unspecified class. The next day, the same submarine severely damaged an enemy cruiser. However, there was no news from her after that. On May 16, 1943 at 18H 30 Min. Off the north coast of the island, Attu submarine I-35 torpedoed an enemy light cruiser, resulting in significant damage to the cruiser. After the attack, the boat was pursued, but the depth bombs dropped by the enemy did not cause her any significant damage. On May 14th, 30 miles west of Attu Island, the submarine I-34 was also attacked 30 miles west of Attu Island and suffered considerable damage, but was able to escape pursuit. In February 1943, I was appointed commander of the submarine I-158, which at that time was being equipped with radar equipment. Initial tests of the equipment were unsuccessful. We could detect a surface submarine at a range of only 1,800 meters, with the target detected either bow or stern. This same equipment had previously been tested on surface ships, but the results there were more successful. In some respects, the new radar equipment was not suitable for submarines. While there was a discussion about whether to adopt it for submarines, despite some shortcomings, or not, came the news of the landing of the Americans on Attu Island, and 2 submarines of the flotilla were immediately sent north. My boat was left to carry out further tests, that is, to study the operation of the radio equipment for reception underwater. We received news that a submarine of the same type as ours I-157, following on June 16th in thick fog to the shores of Kaiska Island at a speed of 14 knots. All attempts to get off the shoal were in vain. Then the commander, in order to lighten the boat, ordered to throw overboard 6 torpedoes, 113 battery accumulators, 12 tons of lubricating oil and 74 tons of fuel. It was not easy to get rid of the torpedoes and batteries. Under normal conditions, when loading and unloading batteries, part of the submarine hull is opened up, but in this emergency the batteries had to be broken and discarded piece by piece. At 13 HR H20 min. The next day the boat finally managed to get off the shoal and she arrived safely in Kur on June 26th. The boat, of course, could not dive, but fortunately on the way she did not meet the enemy. Had this submarine been equipped with radar equipment, she might have avoided the grounding described above. Other boats operating in the area in fog conditions and without radar equipment continued to play a game of whack-a-mole. Clearly they could not operate successfully against American ships that had radar stations. 3 of the 17 submarines available to the northern group of forces were busy evacuating personnel and equipment from Kaiska Island. The boats made at least 13 trips and evacuated a total of 820 people from the island to the corals, as well as delivered 100 tons of food, 125 tons of equipment and ammunition to Kaiska Island. Meanwhile, the submarine I-24, on which I served at the beginning of the war, was ordered to take on board the personnel of the communications group on Attu Island, which managed to move to the area of Chichagov Bay. 3 times this boat approached the bay, but it failed to find any trace of the group, so the order given to this boat was cancelled. However, nothing has been heard of the submarine itself since then. The submarine I-9 was sunk during the second voyage to Kaiska Island. After the war, we heard that she was sunk on June 10th by an American anti-submarine ship on the approaches to Kaiska Island while travelling in fog. The submarine I-7, which arrived on the third voyage to Vega Bay, had to engage in an artillery battle with an enemy patrol ship. As a result of a direct hit by a shell in the boat's deckhouse, its commander and the flotilla commander were killed. The boat then ran aground inside the bay. However, the next day she managed to run aground, after which she proceeded to Yokosuka. On the night of June 22nd, while proceeding in fog, she was fired upon by 3 American destroyer squadrons. In doing so, the chief mate, who had taken command of the boat only the day before, was killed. The boat under the command of the artillery combatant commander tried to escape pursuit, but ran aground and was lost. It was essentially a battle between the blind and the sighted. The enemy could follow us even in the fog and open fire without warning. The enemy's shells found their target, and with a pierced deckhouse we could not dive. After the incident with the submarine I-7, boats operating in the north were removed from evacuation operations. This task began to be successfully performed by destroyer squadrons. In studying this war blind in the Operations Directorate in Tokyo, consternation set in. It was asked why no radar equipment had been installed on submarines so far. As a result of the change in attitude, it was ordered that radar equipment for detecting surface targets be immediately installed on the submarines. As for the other boats, the submarines I-2, I-26 and I-109 were also shelled in the fog, but they managed to dive and evade pursuit and return safely to base. After the evacuation of Afar, Kaiska submarines I-2 and I-56 were left in the north to act to disrupt enemy naval communications and patrols. However, low temperatures and very heavy storms, in which the hulls of the boats were badly damaged, actually hampered their operations more than the enemy. In mid-November, in the vicinity of the island of Amchitka, submarine I-2 sank an enemy transport. Our losses in submarines during operations in the north amounted to 6 units. The submarines themselves sank a battleship, 2 light cruisers, a floating hydroaviation base, 4 transports and 1 ship, the type of which is not established. In the area of Kaiska Island, 5 ultra-small submarines were sent to the area of Kaiska Island, but due to various reasons, including storms, they were damaged and did not find their use in this area. The equipment of our bases in the north was insufficient, and in comparison with the German bases, where there were even shelters for submarines, they can be called primitive. The fact that our defense was treated with some neglect, preferring offensive action, could be seen as a strength of the Japanese Navy, but it was also its great weakness. With aviation now the predominant means of combat, bases without adequate defenses become unfit for their missions. Under such conditions, the weapons, for the construction of which so much time, money and material had been expended, would in fact be utterly useless. Crews who lost their ships went either to replenish landing parties or were assigned to anti-aircraft batteries. The situation in the Solomon Islands, despite our counterattacks, was deteriorating daily. On November 19, 1943, the main forces of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, under the flag of Fleet Commander Admiral Nimitz, headed for the Gilbert Islands, and soon our forces, located on the atolls Tarawa and Makin, came under extreme pressure from the enemy. The Americans sent 1 Marine division each to Tarawa and Makin atolls, supported by aircraft and ships, which conducted air raids and bombardment from the sea of such force that everything on these islands could be destroyed to the ground. Our troops were inferior to the numerically superior enemy forces, and therefore by November 25th, the garrisons on these atolls were destroyed. Submarines I-169, I-175, I-35, I-19 and I-39, which at that time were being withdrawn from a position 300 miles southwest of Pearl Harbor, were ordered to proceed at full speed to the Gilbert Islands. In addition, 4 other submarines were also ordered to go into the same area to assist the troops. This was one of the orders given without regard for casualties. Orders like this eventually led to the loss of our submarine fleet. In this case, only 3 of the 9 submarines survived. One of those 3 boats, the I-175, sank the aircraft carrier Liscombe Bay, and despite being pursued by several destroyers, returned safely to base. The submarine I-174, which had been engaged in cargo transports in the New Guinea area, also received orders to proceed to the Gilbert Islands on the night of November 26, 1943. Noticing aircraft lights, she made an emergency dive. Enemy planes were in the area of the boat dive for about 3 hours, but there was no attack. After waiting another half-hour, the boat I-174 surfaced. It was a clear moonless night. Following its course, the submarine was charging batteries. At about 8 p.m., 00 min. An observer, noticing a white storm created by a fast-moving ship, shouted a destroyer. The distance to the enemy destroyer was about 275 meters. The submarine made an emergency dive. When the depth reached 27 meters, depth bombs began to burst. From the strong shaking caused by the explosions, the lights went out in the boat, the switchboard was damaged, the power supply to the electric motors stopped. In order to stop further sinking, it was necessary to blow out the tanks, but in doing so, air bubbles reached the surface and well marked the target for the enemy, who intensified the attack. The diesel and electric motor compartments of the boat had already received a lot of water, and to eliminate trim and protect the motors from flooding, had to scoop water from the electric motor compartment and pour it into the diesel compartment using empty cans of lubricating oil. After the batteries ran out and the air supply ran out, there was no other option but to surface and fight. 2 minutes later, after surfacing, an airplane appeared. The boat submerged again, expecting to use the last reserve, all the compressed air torpedoes. When she surfaced again, the enemy aircraft was still nearby, but a rescue squall helped the boat to escape from pursuit. After returning to the base, the submarine commander submitted a report to the commander of the submarine forces, in which he noted that the actions of submarines without the presence of radar is tantamount to simple suicide, because how could a submarine that can stay underwater for only 40 hours? At a speed of 2 to 3 knots against aircraft, destroyers and other ships of the anti-submarine forces. However, the admiral disagreed with the opinion of the commander of the boat I-174, believing that, despite the losses, the boats still performed their tasks. Nevertheless, there was no doubt that our submarines for 2 years were at a great disadvantage, because they had to deal with the enemy, equipped with effective radar equipment. We were simply unable to do anything against surprise enemy attacks, and so many submarines died for nothing. To get much-needed improvements introduced, including increased battery capacity, better methods of rapid charging, and the installation of radar equipment, were unsuccessful. In May 1944, the submarine I-45 was ordered to search for the enemy east of the Marshall Islands. Carrying out the order, the boat passed Bungo Strait at full speed and headed for her designated area. One morning, while the boat was in a surface position, the boat commander, resting below, heard the watch officer's command, "Urgent dive." Following this, the boat was attacked by an enemy airplane looming from behind the clouds. Not having time to dive, the boat received a direct hit in the stern. The explosion lifted the entire boat, its bow was on the surface. The enemy opened fire from machine guns. Deciding to save the boat, the commander tried to slowly go underwater by backing up. This succeeded. The boat began to slowly sink, having a trim of 7. The depth of submergence reached 138 meters. At this depth underwater pressure, the sheets of the strong hull of the aft part of the boat became concave. In order to stop further sinking, the order was given to blow out the main ballast tank. However, while blowing, air bubbles reached the water surface and were noticed by the enemy, who did not hesitate to repeat the attack. Fortunately, the crew managed to keep the boat at a depth of 92 meters, where it remained all day until sunset. Under cover of darkness, the boat surfaced to determine the nature of the damage. There was a large hole in the stern, and it was necessary to go to Yokosuka for repairs. The passage went smoothly at first, but in Tokyo Bay, in the thick of anti-submarine nets, the steering failed. After some effort, the boat managed to get out and reached Yokosuka safely. Inspection in dry dock showed that the boat had only one vertical rudder. The rest of the rudders were lost. The boat was just lucky to reach the base in this condition. Even before the enemy landed on Saipan, various guesses were made about the location of the upcoming landing, but intelligence was not able to give the command reliable information on this issue. The enemy landing on Saipan was made on June 15, 1944. The submarines were ordered to concentrate in the vicinity of Saipan, but they did not have time to take up attack positions. In the second half of May 1944, 8 submarines took up positions 150 miles north of the Admiralty Islands. They were tasked to strike at the American forces traveling along the coast of New Guinea to the islands of Biak and Palau. The enemy has already well-practiced tactics to combat our submarines. Having detected one boat, he began to search in the area and others, forcing them to stay underwater all the time. In this case, one of our boats was detected upon arrival in the area assigned to her for patrolling. As a result, all other boats were also attacked by enemy aircraft and ships upon arrival at their positions. They bombed the submarine row 109 all day long. At this time, information was received from the Submarine Force Headquarters that the enemy is fully aware of the disposition of all our submarines involved in this operation. The boats row 109 and row 108, acting independently, immediately changed course and took positions several hundred miles away from the named area. As a result, they were able to escape. The other 5 row-type boats were sunk. The submarine I-44, which was the first to be armed with radar equipment, survived. She was ordered to proceed north of the Admiralty Islands. Leaving Kure on May 15th, she headed for position. Proceeding overnight in a surface position, the boat was suddenly attacked by enemy aircraft. The officer of the watch gave the order to make an emergency dive. When the boat surfaced a little later, airplanes appeared again and began bombing the boat. The boat's radar station was working badly, so the boat had to dive again and remain in an underwater position. During the night, when everyone in the boat was asleep, a series of depth bomb explosions suddenly followed, as a result of which the depth gauge was disabled and water appeared in almost all compartments. By 11 o'clock, the batteries had only 1 hour's power left. The chief mate, being a very brave officer, suggested to surface and take the fight, as further stay underwater with empty batteries became no less dangerous. The commander of the boat agreed with his arguments and ordered that preparations be made for an artillery battle and that machine guns and revolvers be ready. Observation through the periscope showed that there was a flying boat in the air, and not far away a destroyer was waiting for its victim. At this moment a squall suddenly came. This opportunity could not be missed, so the boat surfaced and, leaving behind the stern destroyer, at full speed began to go to the northwest. About an hour later, a 4-engine flying boat appeared within sight. However, it flew away without attacking the submarine. Approaching Saipan, the boat made an attempt to dive, but the ventilation valves failed and had to open the low-pressure distribution valve. The boat was thus saved and was able to fight in the following days. When the enemy landed on Saipan, all available submarines were sent to the area, including Row 115, which had previously patrolled in the Palau area. By June 19th, the boat had reached a position 50 miles west of Is. Rota, she was proceeding in a surface position in waters well controlled by enemy aircraft. Suddenly, she was attacked by airplanes. One of the bombs exploded only 40 meters from the boat, but caused no damage and the boat continued onward. Then a rather large unit of enemy forces appeared, and she had to go underwater again. For a long time, submarine Row 115 tried to detect the connection of enemy aircraft carriers and finally succeeded. After sunset, the submarine penetrated the destroyer escort and fired 4 torpedoes at the aircraft carrier type Wasp. The results of the attack could not be observed, as the boat immediately submerged. Unfortunately, she was unable to escape the attack. As a result of the explosions of depth bombs in the boat formed a leak and half of the lighting was taken out of service. But nothing worse happened in the aftermath. Having used up the entire available stock of torpedoes, the boat returned to Truk. By this time, submarines Row 113, Row 114, Row 109 and I-5 had already arrived there. When the Americans launched an offensive on the island of Guam, the submarine Row 114 was ordered to circle the island and attack enemy ships. But after the boat reported that it had torpedoed a large enemy ship, it was never heard from again. Submarines I-26, I-45 and I-55 left Yokosuka for Guam, having on board tanks, guns and ammunition. However, only one I-26 managed to reach the island. There was no news of the submarine I-55 after it left Yokosuka, and the boat I-45 returned to Yokosuka after the fastener holding the tank loosened, and it was washed out to sea. Submarine I-26 managed to get the tank to Guam Island, which was blockaded by the enemy. Reaching the place of unloading, the boat, going underwater, touched the ground, and then stuck in it, it seemed, intentionally. The commander ordered the navigator to clarify the location. The navigator reported that in the southwest of the island there is a shoal on which probably they sat down. After waiting for the sun to set, the boat started the engines, backed up, and after some effort, she got off the shoal and reached the periscope depth. Inspection showed that the boat had actually run aground at the very point of unloading. Having accomplished her mission, submarine I-26 slipped through enemy cordons and returned to Yokosuka. During the fighting for Saipan, 13 submarines were lost: Row 36, Row 42, Row 44, Row 48, Row 111, Row 114, Row 117, I-5, I-6, I-10, I-55, I-184, and I-185. The remaining boats I-26, I-38, I-41, I-44, I-45, Row 109, Row 112, Row 113, and Row 115 returned safely to base. In the battle for Saipan, submarines began to operate for the first time with radar equipment. Of the boats that had radar equipment, only 1/3 were damaged, while 2/3 of the boats that did not have such equipment were lost. This clearly illustrates the great importance of radar. At the end of August 1944, submarine I-165 urgently went to Corin Bay on the island of Biak, which was completely isolated and partially occupied by the enemy. Her mission was to communicate with the surviving troops on the island. In particular, she was to evacuate the air commander. Before going to sea, the boat loaded food, ammunition, medical supplies, portable electric flashlights. In addition, 60 metal barrels were secured on the upper deck, which also contained food. When the island was already clearly looming on the horizon, 3 torpedo boats were spotted from the boat. She managed to submerge, but the boats started dropping depth bombs. At a depth of 98 meters, the solid hull of the boat began to make strange creaking noises. Cracks appeared in the paint. The boat was old, so the water pressure was taking its toll. The commander immediately reduced the diving depth to 90 meters, continuing to evade pursuit. However, the torpedo boats kept up. It is possible that some of the barrels on the upper deck of the boat broke off and floated, thus giving away its location. The hunt for the boat continued for over 24 hours. The commander decided to free himself from all the barrels on the upper deck and attempt to leave. But despite the measures taken, the enemy continued to pelt the boat with depth bombs. It was possible to block the fuel leakage to the surface with the help of special devices with which submarines were equipped for this purpose. However, there was damage to the solid hull at the stern, and more water was entering the boat. The water accumulated in the electric motor compartment was carried by buckets to the diesel compartment, but the stern of the boat continued to fail. The temperature in the boat rose to 65 degrees, and the oxygen supply was depleted to the point where it became difficult to breathe. The crew decided to bravely face death, which seemed inevitable. However, that night the enemy refused to pursue further, and at 22 HRs, 00 min, the boat surfaced and headed for Amboyna Island with the greatest speed it could develop. A later inspection of the boat showed that the auxiliary stern rudder was badly bent. There was other serious damage as well. Submarines I-10 and I-38 made repeated attempts to evacuate the submarine force headquarters from Saipan, but were unable to do so. Finally, in June, a telegram was received from the commander of the submarine force announcing that he and his staff and the personnel of the ultra-small submarines had managed to escape. On October 20, 1944, American forces began landing on Leyte Island. The remnants of our submarine forces were ordered to concentrate in the Philippines area by October 11th. A total of 11 submarines Row 41, Row 43, Row 46, I-26, I-38, I-41, I-45, I-46, I-53, I-54 and Despite the fact that the enemy was detected quite often, only the submarine I-56 managed to go on the attack. On October 22nd, she detected a large group of ships using radar and met the enemy convoy that night. Having penetrated through the guards, she sank an enemy transport with 3 torpedoes. October 25th, on the approaches to Leyte Island, the same submarine with the help of radar again detected enemy ships and immediately submerged. This time she managed to attack a group of enemy aircraft carriers, releasing one of them 5 torpedoes. 3 explosions were noted. One of the torpedoes fired hit a destroyer escort. The boat was heavily attacked by depth bombs, which continued intermittently for several hours. The diesel compartment was partially flooded and the lights were knocked out. The boat commander calmed the crew by ordering them to clarify the reason for the water entering the boat. And the reason was that one of the valves had come loose. The boat was underwater for 24 hours, and when it surfaced, an unexploded depth bomb weighing about 30 kg was found in the stern on the upper deck, which, taking precautions, was taken to the shipyard in Kura. The 6 other submarines operating off Leyte Island did not return to base. Submarine I-41 reported that off the east coast of the Philippines on October 27th, she sank a transport, and on November 3rd aircraft carrier type Essex. Then, from mid-November to mid-December, submarines Row 41, Row 43, Row 49, Row 50, Row 109, and Row 112 were in position off the east coast of the Philippines. During this period, submarine Row 50 reported the sinking of an enemy aircraft carrier and destroyer. In early January 1945, when American forces made a landing in Lingayen Gulf submarine, Row 45 attacked an Idaho-class battleship on January 12th, and the boat Row 46 west of Iba sank 2 transports. On January 17th, off the west coast of Lingayen Gulf, submarine Row 109 torpedoed an enemy aircraft carrier, cruiser, and destroyer, each hit by 2 torpedoes. Boat Row 50 on February 1st southeast of Surigao sank a transport. The submarines Row 112, Row 113, and Row 115 were on a cargo transport mission between Takawa and the northern tip of Luzon Island, but were sunk between February 10th to 13th. The turning point in submarine warfare was the moment when all enemy ships and aircraft received effective radar equipment. I have already given many examples of how our submarines without radar were at a disadvantage. Below I will give some examples from my own experience. In September 1943, on the submarine Row 44, which I commanded, was completed installation of radar station for detection of surface targets and began its testing. The question of installing on submarines radar stations for the detection of airborne targets was still under consideration at that time. During the testing of the station on my boat, I spoke with a representative of the Navy's technical department, Captain Second Rank Ito, who said that he insisted on the immediate installation of the airborne target detection radar station with a radius of over 7 kilometers, which was available at that time. Knowing that the ministry officials were somewhat slow to act, despite their knowledge of the true state of affairs, Ito recommended that a senior officer from the headquarters of the 11th Submarine Squadron be sent to Tokyo to personally push the matter. Unfortunately, this officer, already having permission to go to Tokyo, was transferred to serve elsewhere, and this idea did not work out. But the matter could not be left like that, and I tried to go to Tokyo myself, but I did not get permission to go. In the meantime, I visited the Navy Air Base in Kure, where I got acquainted with the work of radar station for the detection of air targets. The station was portable and could well be installed on a submarine. I persuaded the senior staff officer to ask the commander of the airbase to give us for a while this station. Having received consent, we brought this station on a truck of the shipyard in Kura, and within one day, that is November 12th, adjusted and installed it on the submarine. On November 13th, I contacted the Navy Air Base at Kure and asked them to send us an airplane to serve as a target for the tests. We began the tests at Eyes Bay in good weather. The installation gave very inaccurate readings. After an engine malfunction occurred on the supply airplane, we had to stop the tests. The next day the flying conditions were ideal, and early in the morning we were out to sea again. This time target detection was good at a range of 4,600 to 5,500 meters. The maximum range of target detection reached 11600 meters. True, these results were not brilliant, but they could greatly improve our position. The commander of the 11th Submarine Squadron urgently sent the results of the tests to the appropriate authority, but from there they asked why the tests were conducted without the consent of the Technical Department of Naval Forces. All hopes for a speedy resolution of this issue were gradually disappearing. I again tried to get permission to travel to Tokyo with plans to install radar on submarines of the type Rho, but still could not get it. In the meantime, we were soon to head for Maizuru to make final preparations to get the boat ready for combat operations. This meant that we were out of the 11th Submarine Squadron and into the submarine force of the 6th Fleet. I again began to insist on my deployment, and finally permission was granted. In Tokyo, I presented my point of view at a meeting at the Navy's Technical Directorate. The senior chief present at the meeting raised a number of objections and stated that the new equipment developed by the Technical Directorate would soon be ready, and we should have waited until it was in service. It turned out that the radar station developed by the Navy's Technical Directorate was being tested at the shipyard in Kure, but there was no hope that it would be completed soon. This gave me the idea of testing the said station on my own boat. But I could not get a positive answer, and the meeting decided to postpone consideration of this issue. Considering such a decision more than unsatisfactory, the next day I went to the research department, where I was received more cordially. We discussed all the technical difficulties and found ways to overcome them. Having secured the support of the research department, I went a second time to the Navy Technical Department, where I again tried to get my question resolved, but the proposals of the research department were not accepted. I think the real reason for the rejection this time was interdepartmental squabbling. There was no time for further arguments, as I had to return to Maizuru. The case I have described is really regrettable, because to all appearances the staff of our headquarters was more concerned about preserving their prestige than about the needs of the active fleet. The only thing I was able to accomplish was to obtain one additional pair of binoculars for the observers. Shortly thereafter, we headed for the battle area to the south. Our submarine still did not have an air target detection radar station. Our course was through Bungo Strait, and since this was a favorite ambush point for enemy submarines, we had to go overhead at top speed during the night and go under at dawn. The thought of having to hide and go underwater near our native shores was not a pleasant one. But such were the harsh facts of war. On the other night of our stay at sea, we were already out of the dangerous area and went all the time without submerging. During this period, our position in the Marshall Islands and Rabaul was solid, and so we did not have to fear enemy air raids all the way to Truk. The day of the New Year 1944 we met in the sea, And on the 10th day after we left Majzuru with its snowstorms, we were already enjoying the warmth of the tropics. Early in January, at the entrance to Truk Bay, we saw a majestic picture of the Yamato and the bulk of the United States fleet at anchor. When reporting the arrival of the boat to the commander of the 6th Fleet, I told of my attempts to install a radar station on the boat to detect air targets. Submarine I-185 left Japanese waters and headed for the battle area at the same time as us. Arriving at Rabaul, the commander of this boat also reported to the fleet commander of the Southeast Zone about the desirability of installing radars. Fortunately, a set of aircraft radar was available at Rabaul, and Submarine I-185 quickly installed it at her place. The results were somewhat better than those obtained when a similar station was tested on the submarine Row 44. This fact was immediately reported to all concerned authorities. The Chief of Staff of the fleet personally flew to Tokyo to reopen the issue. And again, to our great regret, the decision to immediately install on the boat's radar stations to detect air targets was not taken. The crews of submarines in the forward areas of combat operations were as eager to have such stations installed as farmers are eager for rain during a long drought. Under the regulations in force at the time, submarines were required to refrain from using radar whenever possible for fear that their work might be detected by the enemy. Instead, it was recommended that a special receiving device be used to detect enemy transmissions. Many commanders and even some submarine commanders adhered to this theoretical position, but the majority stood on the view that it was better to use their radars than to be seduced by the comparatively small hope of intercepting enemy transmissions. The latter method, by the way, failed utterly in the fighting at Kaiska Island. In fact, the only radar station available on our submarines was the one we received from the Germans. Thus, we came to the point of relying on foreign help. What was the reason for this disgraceful state of affairs? Was it to be considered a gap in our scientific knowledge and in our electrical industry as a whole? Unfortunately, that was exactly what it was. In spite of all our poverty, was it not better to devote more of the country's resources to RD? Our policy of developing RD was based on backward principles, so the inevitable result was the blindness of our submarines. At Guadalcanal Island, American planes bombed every submarine at the first sighting, both day and night, without waiting for identification. There is no doubt that the American submarines, which had modern radar equipment, were able to submerge even before they were detected by our aircraft. Thus, the pilots of American airplanes approaching a submarine following in a surface position, there was no doubt that in front of them one of the deaf and blind Japanese boats. In our desperation, we were almost ready to admit that one radar station was more important than 100 submarines. On May 15, 1944, I surrendered command of the submarine Row 44 in connection with my assignment as commander of the submarine I-58, which was being completed. I was entitled to 1 month's leave, but not needing it, I devoted all that time to radar matters. When I reported to the 6th Fleet Headquarters, recently transferred here from Truk, I came across a document which proposed to remove useless radar stations from submarines to detect surface targets. To my surprise, the author of this fantastic proposal turned out to be the commander of the submarine force himself. I knew nothing about the results of later tests of radar on submarines, but I could not refrain from expressing my thoughts on the document written by the Admiral. To remove this useful equipment from submarines is premature. Moreover, it would be a step backward technically. Why are radar stations on submarines considered useless, while at the same time the same stations are used on surface ships? If further research shows that they are worthless, then they can be removed from submarine armament. In my opinion, the submarine crew has unlimited opportunities to improve radar performance, and I therefore request that the decision to remove the radar stations be deferred until the I-58 submarine is completed. I then visited the personnel office of the Kure Naval Base and explained that the failure to utilize electronic equipment on the submarines was mainly due to the lack of experienced personnel in the crews. For a year and a half, while radar equipment was being tested on submarines, the crews of these boats lacked highly qualified specialists, and I insisted that 2 such specialists be sent to the submarine I-58. After much searching, we found together with an experienced officer the best way, in our opinion, to install a radar station on the submarine. Finally, I received orders to take command of the submarine I-58 and left for Yokosuka. At the shipyard, I met with various officials and asked them all together and individually not to delay the installation of the new equipment on the submarine. The method we proposed entailed a change in the placement of the radar station for detecting surface targets, and a change in two parts in the machine gun mount. In both of these cases, the factory representatives, although regretting the matter, seemed really unable to carry out the work in question. I therefore had to seek the assistance of the technical and research department to install the equipment as I wished. It is possible that such action on my part offended the plant officials, but there was a war going on which did not allow for much ceremony. In peacetime, all this could have been left to the discretion of the plant management, but now, under any circumstances, I did not repent for my actions, because the safety of the boat and my own life depended on it. The plant managers at first refused to compromise, and I again had endless hassles before they installed everything the way I wanted it. The radar specialist that had been promised to me by the personnel department was delayed, but after 3 letters from me asking me to expedite his shipment, he finally arrived in January. Apparently, the communications school tried to delay him because there was also a shortage of specialists there. The fighting for Saipan began when our boat was still being completed. Many of the submarines sent to that area and to the Guam area were lost. The fall of Saipan was a death blow to us. After Saipan fell into enemy hands, air raids on Tokyo began. The completion of the boat I-58 was coming to an end. We had already reached the deep sea diving tests. The operating depth of the submarine I-58 was 91.5 meters, but the boat could withstand water pressure at a depth of 138 meters. This was very necessary in wartime when evading attacks by depth bombs. On the first day of the test at a depth of 61 meters, the boat developed a strong leak, so the test was interrupted. The next day the faults were corrected and the trials continued. This time everything went without delay. During the dive tests, a buoy was attached to the stern of the submarine to mark its position. Before the test began, the diameter of the boat's solid hull was measured in several places. The boat was then submerged and measurements were taken every 30 feet to determine the degree of hull compression. The hull was checked for leaks. In addition, the performance of the casting pumps was checked. The tests showed that everything was in good working order. As the boat surfaced, similar measurements were also taken every 30 feet. When the boat surfaced, a check had to be made to see if the hull of the boat had returned to its original condition, that is, if it had not deformed. Most of the naval training facilities were located near Yokosuka. This was very convenient from the point of view of training submarine personnel. I was able to send my signalmen and diesel mechanics for short courses, and so the level of training of these specialists was very high. During the war, one observed the construction of 3 submarines, so I was extremely impressed by the much greater productivity of the private shipyards. Compared to the naval shipyards, the latter did not seem to be concerned about either time or money being wasted. Finally, the I-58 submarine was officially commissioned and headed for the inland sea of Japan, where she joined the training squadron to finally put the ship in combat condition. After the war, the Americans said that close interaction between aviation and surface ships is a very important factor in conducting combat operations against submarines, and that under normal conditions both aviation and ships should be subordinated to a single command. The effectiveness of this interaction was tested by our submarines when they were subjected to sustained attacks by destroyers, small anti-submarine ships and enemy aircraft. Such attacks intensified from August 1942, when the Americans, using radar, began to make night attacks on our submarines, that is, when we had no means of counteraction. With the introduction of these anti-submarine tactics by the Americans, we began to suffer huge losses. This was noted in the battles off Makin and Tarawa atolls, in 1943 during the second phase of the campaign in the Solomon Islands, and in 1944 to 1945 in the battles off Admiralty Islands, Saipan, the Philippines and Okinawa. If a submarine is submerged for more than 40 hours, it must surface and remain on the surface for a time sufficient to replace the air. Further, even if the batteries are fully charged, they do not last more than 40 hours. When a submarine is forced to submerge without fully charging its batteries, it cannot remain submerged for the length of time indicated above. Occasionally, individual submarines were able to stay underwater longer, but in this case the boat had no propulsion and was kept at a given depth by taking on or pumping out water. This, of course, resulted in energy savings, but eventually the battery's supply of electricity ran out, and many times our submarines were forced to surface in close proximity to the enemy. Sometimes the submarines were detected by the enemy while surfacing to recharge the batteries, and then during an emergency dive they were subjected to heavy attacks with depth bombs. Some boats were saved by staying underwater for a long time, but most boats had to surface and fight with the enemy waiting for them. Sometimes it was necessary to dive urgently, without a supply of high-pressure air, and when surfacing to take it from the torpedo tubes. This meant that the submarine became unarmed, because the compressed air cylinders for torpedo firing could not be charged without surfacing. So, there was no way to overcome this weakness, as a result of which the submarine was forced to surface after 40 hours of being underwater. In most cases, under such circumstances, managed to save only those submarines that were helped by a squall or some other natural conditions. In fighting against our submarines, American boats were very successful. After the war, we were very surprised to learn the actual reasons for our losses. In fact, Japanese submarine losses from American air action were much lower. This should probably be attributed to poor shooting and inaccurate bombing, although the number of air attacks was high. Only in a few instances did heavy damage from hits cause submarine deaths. The idea of striking with a torpedo, fired by a submarine but controlled by a human occupant, had taken shape by the time of the first attack on Pearl Harbor. Several such torpedoes were produced for the first series of tests. They were tested near the Kure naval base on an island known by the code name Base II. By January 1943, the development of the human torpedo project had reached a stage where it seemed that they could be put into production and then used in combat. However, the design of torpedoes excluded the possibility of saving the person who controlled such a torpedo, that is, he was doomed to certain death, which was opposed by the Naval Command. In the design of the torpedo was introduced a device that allows a simple push of a button to eject the driver into the sea at a distance of about 45 meters from the target. Around February 1944, a prototype of the human torpedo was delivered to naval headquarters, and the torpedoes were soon put into production. With a passionate hope for success began their production in the experimental torpedo shop of the shipyard in Kure. On this weapon were pinned great hopes. Now, it seemed, it was possible to repay the enemy for the heavy losses suffered by Japan. By this time, Saipan had fallen into American hands and we had suffered heavy losses. The new weapon was called Kaitens, which meant the way to paradise. While the torpedoes were being made, a base was organized in Tokuyama Bay to train personnel. Alas! On the first day of testing in Tokuyama Bay drowned one of the volunteers and advocates of this weapon. The torpedo he was on buried itself in the mud and could not be raised. This was a bad omen for the future. Nevertheless, intensive training of personnel continued for 2 months. On November 8, 1944, the Kikumizu detachment was formed and sent to the battle area. Manned torpedoes were taken aboard 3 submarines, I-36, I-47 and I-37. The first 2 were sent to the Ulithi Islands area, while submarine I-37 was sent to the Cossel Passage near Palau Island. November 19th, submarines I-36 and I-47, according to the plan, approached the Ulithi Islands. Reconnaissance showed that there was a large group of American ships, including aircraft carriers, line and other ships. November 20th at 16 hours. 30 men. From the submarine I-36 was launched 1-man torpedo, and from the I-47 4. A senior officer, who was an ardent supporter of the use of these weapons, left the following letter before Leash. Today's observation shows over 100 ships anchored off Ulithi Islands. Despite the fact that there is a great opportunity to use our Kaitens, we have only 8 of them on 2 submarines. It is clearly not enough. What a pity. He thanked the commander of the submarine I-47 for clarifying the composition of the enemy forces and bringing the boat to a position very convenient for the attack. Wishing the boat I-47 a happy voyage, he said, "Thank you for the help you have given me. Give my regards to those who will follow me." He then took his place in the torpedo. The results of the attack, as well as the fate of himself, remained unknown. On December 1st, the submarines I-36 and I-47 returned safely to cure. The boat I-37, which went to the Palau area, was lost. Although the results achieved by the Kikumizu detachment could not be ascertained, much was still expected of the manned torpedoes. A new squadron was formed named Congo, which included 6 surviving large submarines of the newest type. According to the order issued, The submarines of the detachment were to operate as follows. I-36 went to the area of Ulithi Islands, I-47 in the area of Hollandia, I-56 to the Admiralty Islands, I-53 to the Palau area, and I-58 was headed for Guam. All submarines were to conduct attacks on January 11th. 1945 submarine I-48 was to attack a little later, namely January 20th. There were 15 of us who had graduated from the naval school in the course of submarine navigation. But by this time most of the officers who had once made up our class had been killed in action. Out of 15 people, only 5 survived. By a strange coincidence, all of them turned out to be the commanders of the boats belonging to the detachment Congo. Manned torpedoes were made in conditions of deep secrecy, but we knew that they had already been used in the first attack at Ulithi Islands. One of the officers leading the attack wrote, "The use of human torpedoes in the future is a great challenge. The more we take advantage of the opportunities for attack, the more attention should be paid to the tactics of using these weapons." In other words, it was to be assumed that the Americans were already aware of the actions of manned torpedoes, so they would be alert after our second attack. Thus, both the submarines' approach to the launching point of the manned torpedoes and their departure to attack the targets became a risky business. Our assumptions were confirmed. The submarine I-58, which I commanded, having completed preparations for the Saipan campaign, went to Kure to receive fuel, food and torpedoes. On December 29th, the boat went to the manned torpedo base, where the commander of the submarine force addressed the personnel. We were photographed to commemorate the event, and after a solemn send-off the boats I-58, I-36 and I-53 left the bay. The send-off was attended by many boats crowded with people. There were shouts of approval from the boats for the crews of the boats. In the manned torpedoes sat the drivers waving their sabres. They had white armbands on their heads. Our boat number I-58 written on the deckhouse had been scrubbed off and replaced by the emblem of the Congo Squadron. A flag with the inscription "Inevitable Kaiten" was hoisted on the forecastle next to the Navy flag. After passing Bungo Strait, the boat turned southward, proceeding in a surface position. In the evening gloom we cast a farewell glance at our native land, then its last islands disappeared over the horizon. There were many enemy submarines on our way, so we had to be on guard all the time. We were zigzagging, and at night we had to go at an increased speed. For the first time we used the radar station for detecting air targets, but soon became convinced that it did not work well. We had to send a specialist on deck to make the necessary repairs. We had a vested interest in not being detected by the enemy. The night passed and it was January 1st, 1945. The boat was sailing with a northwest wind. The sunrise that morning was truly beautiful. Normally, alcoholic beverages were forbidden at sea, but on the occasion of the holiday, permission was given to dispense sake. After the boat was loaded, greetings were given in honor of the Emperor, followed by various toasts. During the voyage to the target, the 2 officers from the human torpedo teams were always with us at meals, while the midshipmen ate with the boat's crew, and so we hardly ever saw them. Today, however, we invited them to the wardroom and dined together. Since January 2nd, our boat has been within range of enemy aircraft based on the islands of Guam and Saipan, so for the time of probable appearance of aircraft, we went underwater. On this day, going with the radar on, we detected an enemy airplane through binoculars. It became clear that our radar station was unreliable. The observers were ordered to watch relentlessly for the appearance of aircraft. After the Americans regained Guam, it became of great importance to them as a base in the Central Pacific. Although the enemy was not aware of our plans, it was to be expected that he would take every precaution, since the fact that we used manned torpedoes at Ulithi Islands certainly became known to him. The best option in accomplishing our task was to go around Guam and approach it from Guam. Guam and approach it from the side where the enemy's defenses were presumably less strong, so we headed further south and approached the line of communications connecting Ulithi Islands with Guam. In other words, we were approaching Guam from the enemy's side. As we approached the island, the periods of time the boat was underwater lengthened. On January 7th, we passed the line of communications connecting Guam with Ulithi Islands, remaining underwater for long periods of time and keeping a close watch. The question of attacking the enemy before the launching of manned torpedoes was not even raised on any of the boats of the squadron. Our main goal continued to be stealth. There was nothing to do in the boat during long periods of being underwater. The two officers from the torpedo drivers, other than preparing their torpedoes and practicing periscope observation, had no other duties, so they played chess. One of them was present at a manned torpedo attack in the vicinity of the Ulithi Islands, but he himself was unable to go out on the attack because of a torpedo malfunction. He was a very good chess player. The other, a buddy of the commander of the artillery combat unit of our submarine, was a fat and quiet man. As a cadet at the naval school, he came to practice on my boat. That was in 1943. 2 years had passed since then. The former cadet had already become a junior lieutenant, and he was no more than 22 years old. It became sad to think that he was going to certain death, trying to change the course of the war. The time was such that the number of deaths was always increasing, especially in special units. Death spared neither the young nor the old. In such a situation, their deaths were imminent sooner or later. On January 6th, we approached the line of communications linking Guam and Leyte. At 2 a.m., an enemy airplane was detected by radar. The boat submerged and continued to follow the underwater course. So far, we had managed to avoid encountering enemy aircraft. Now that we were close to our target, we could be unexpectedly detected by aircraft. We certainly wanted our radar station to work without fail. But it was too unreliable to warn us of danger in time. In view of this, we had to follow in an underwater position. At about 2 p.m., the boat surfaced. The boat surfaced, as we believed that at this time of day the enemy would have a break in patrol aircraft flights. The weather was good, the sea was calm. A light breeze was blowing. The morale of the personnel was high. Despite the fact that it was January, we wore tropical uniforms. In the sea we found many crates and empty barrels bobbing on the waves. The enemy did not appear. We were able to pass in a surface position for an hour and a half and before sinking, had time to recharge the batteries and ventilate the boat. Now we were to go underwater at night as well. We decided to surface every day at 17 o'clock, assuming that the patrol airplane would reach its final point of the route and lay down on the return course around noon. This assumption was justified, as we never once encountered enemy aircraft during the following days. There is always a loophole like the one we took advantage of, but it would be unwise to take advantage of it every time we approached a target. On January 6th night, we surfaced at 10 p.m., when the aviation on patrol, in our opinion, should have been returning to base. About 22 HRS, 30 min. Several images of aircraft appeared on the radar receiver screen, and observers reported dark silhouettes to windward at a distance of about 140 meters. These were probably ships. We made an emergency dive without waiting for a full clarification of the situation, and, although the sounders did not indicate the presence of ships, continued to remain in the underwater position until 4 o'clock in the morning. The day of our attack was approaching. It was January 9th. Subsequently, we learned that on this day the enemy began landing in Lingayen Bay, on Luzon, the main island of the Philippines. We received a report of the results of the reconnaissance of Guam by our Air Force. However, it did not say anything about enemy ships, and this concerned us somewhat. The fact is that, according to previously received data, at anchor off Guam were aircraft carrier and 60 to 70 other ships and vessels. Therefore, we nourished the hope that there were still 1 to 2 large ships. January 10th, from the fleet commander, received an order to attack in accordance with the developed plan. I reported this order to the torpedo drivers. At 2 o'clock on January 11th, having detected the trace of exhaust gases of an airplane flying at a close distance from our submarine, we immediately dived. Normally, we could determine the time of arrival and departure of enemy aircraft by radio interception. We did not anticipate that an airplane would appear at such a time. It is possible that it was a communications airplane from the Ulithi Islands. At any rate, according to our calculations, there should not have been an enemy airplane on this course. Since January 6th, we had observed many enemy ships and planes, and we ourselves believed that we had remained undetected. If the enemy was conducting a serious search, we would not have been able to pass unnoticed. At the same time, we were convinced that we could not rely on our radar station to detect air targets. On January 11th, about 9 o'clock, we heard the sounds of a passing vessel. Apparently, a merchant ship was traveling unguarded, and this already indicated that the enemy had no information about our approach. In 2 hours, we reached the point from which Guam is usually visible. Carefully raising the periscope, I at first thought that the outline seen in the distance was nothing but a cloud, but closer observation showed that it was indeed Guam. The navigator had done a brilliant job of laying out the course, but it was still 26 miles to the island. I showed the target to the torpedo drivers, and following this we plunged in and headed for the release point. From time to time we heard the noise of the propellers of merchant ships passing us, but they were all proceeding unguarded. The enemy suspected nothing. At dusk we again raised the periscope, but because of the storm nothing could be detected. At 21 o'clock we discovered a large transport passing very close to us, but did not attack it, as it was forbidden to us. We had already given up zigzagging. That evening at dinner we drank to the health of the torpedo drivers and proposed a toast to their success. At 21:43, we surfaced. The boat was now 11 miles west of Ypres Bay. At a speed of 7 knots we headed for the point of release of manned torpedoes. We finally checked the torpedoes, 13 minutes later. After our surfacing, the commander of the Radio Technical Combat Unit reported that intercepted the enemy telegram from Guam, which reported the discovery of a suspicious ship near the island. Was it really about our boat? We still had 2 hours to go. There was nothing left to do but to continue to our destination. Air reconnaissance, conducted on January 9th, found in the Bay of Guam Island. Guam 20 large and 40 small transports, as well as 4 floating docks, which of course compared to large warships were not very important objects. One could really sympathize with the torpedo drivers, but I advised them to look for the largest loaded transports. In addition, I explained to them that the floating dock, which was somewhere in a corner of the bay, also represented a not insignificant target. I further comforted them by telling them that since the last aerial reconnaissance of Guam on January 9th, some aircraft carrier might have arrived there as well. One of the torpedo driving officers left the following note, which I remembered for a long time. I wanted to know all the details of the aerial photographic reconnaissance. Isn't it irresponsible to send us into an attack without giving us any idea of the enemy's defenses or the situation inside the harbour? The enemy seemed to have detected us. I ordered no. 2 and no. 3 torpedo drivers to take their positions immediately. It was cloudy, but some bright stars were visible in the sky. In the darkness we could not see the drivers' faces as they both came to the bridge to report. They remained silent for a while. Then one of them asked, "Commander, where is the constellation Southern Cross's?" Question caught me off guard. I looked around the sky but could not find the constellation. The navigator standing nearby remarked that the constellation was not yet visible, but it would soon appear in the southeast. The drivers, saying simply that they were going to take their seats, shook our hands decisively and left the bridge. By this time Guam loomed before us as a black mass. After a while a column of white smoke rose above it. At 2300 hours, we increased the course to 12 knots to the place of release of manned torpedoes, still remained about an hour of travel. At midnight, strong pulses appeared on the radar screen, which seemed to be coming from 2 different places. Was it a ship, or had the enemy detected us from the shore? Either way, his radar station had obviously detected our boat. We didn't know our exact location. The worst was being too far from our target. For better or worse, I continued toward the island, using the radar to determine the distance to shore. The distance by this time was, as expected, 17 miles. I prepared to dive immediately, hoping to release the manned torpedoes before the enemy attacked, but at that time the diesel compartment reported that water was entering the boat through the diesel exhaust port, and that it was impossible to dive. Willy-nilly, but had to stay in a surface position. There was no other way out. Our situation was unenviable, but after 10 minutes we were able to fix the malfunction. The fault was rectified, and we were able to dive again. While all this was going on, the drivers of torpedoes, no. 2 and no. 3 reported by telephone that they had taken their places. At 2 a.m., I showed through the periscope the lights of Guam to the drivers of torpedoes, no. 2 and no. 3. Guam to the drivers of torpedoes, no. 1 and no. 4, and after wishing them good luck, ordered them to also take their places in the torpedoes. To this day I still recall the composure of these 2 young men. The sailor, whose duty it was to close the bottom cover of the torpedo, did his business and raised his hands, showing that everything was ready. At 2:30 a.m. the order followed: prepare to release manned torpedoes, torpedo rudders, set in accordance with the position of the rudders of the submarine. Before the release of manned torpedoes, communication with them was maintained by telephone. At the moment of torpedoes detachment from the submarine leading to them, telephone wires could be cut. 10 minutes later, everything was ready for the release of torpedoes, scheduled, according to the plan, at 3 a.m. on the assumption that at 4:30 a.m. the light would begin to dawn. The driver of torpedo, no. One reported ready, the last clamp was given, the torpedo's engine started, and the driver rushed toward his target. The last communication with him was cut off at the moment when the torpedo separated from the boat and raced towards the enemy ships standing in the harbor of Guam Island. Guam. At the very last moment before release, the driver exclaimed, "Long live the Emperor." Torpedo, no. 2 was fired in exactly the same way. Despite his youth, its driver remained calm until the end and left the boat without uttering a word. The engine of Torpedo, no. 3 got too much water, and its release was postponed to the last turn. At the release of Torpedo, no. 4 on the phone also sounded, "Long live the Emperor." Finally, Torpedo, no. 3 was also released. Due to the malfunction of the phone, we were unable to hear the last words of its driver. At that moment, there was a violent explosion. We surfaced and, fearing persecution, began to withdraw into the open sea. At 4:30 a.m., Torpedo, no. 1 should have been at the target. We tried to see what was happening in Ypres Bay, but at that very moment an enemy airplane appeared, and we had to dive and leave. However, the airplane did not attack us. We tried to listen to the explosions of torpedoes on the noise detector. At dawn, we surfaced at periscope depth and surveyed the horizon in the eastern direction, but we could not find anything to confirm the successful completion of the torpedo attacks. That night, the submarine remained in an underwater position until 2300 hours. At dinner, we prayed for the souls of the 4 fallen soldiers, and then put their personal effects in order. One of them, Lieutenant Ishikawa, wrote the following just before his torpedo was fired: "The day of decisive action, in which I and my 3 comrades are participating, has arrived. We are all in good health. Our spirits are buoyant. At Ypres they will be amazed at our actions. A pale moon is looking down from the sky, and rare stars are twinkling aloft. At the beginning of January, it is. Guam seems quiet in its slumber and sails calmly before me. Who knows what turmoil will rise there in a few hours? In the name of our great country, we have come to our appointed place. Only 21 years of life, lived like a dream. But the full meaning of that life will only be revealed today. At the time of the decisive battle between Japan and America, we must, in one blow, correct our shaken position and thereby consolidate forever the glorious Great Japan that has existed for 3,000 years. Great Japan is the land of the gods. The land of the gods is eternal and cannot be destroyed. We are not afraid of death. Thousands, tens of thousands of young men will be born in the future, and we are now quietly sacrificing our lives for our motherland. Let us cut ourselves off from petty worldly affairs and pass on to the world where eternal justice reigns." Another of them wrote the following: "Despite the constant favor of the gods for our empire, exertion, sincerity, justice, and honesty are needed. Without these things, nothing is of value. In the future, even while relying on the favor of the gods, we must remember the danger. Great Japan is determined to win. The decisive battle has spilled over into enemy territory. May the spirit of those who go to heaven witness our struggle to the very end." With a bitter feeling, we set out on our return journey to our native shores, keeping our course northward to Bungo Strait. It would be good to attack the enemy's ships on the way back. I did not expect that we would soon have such an opportunity. We set out to search in a northerly direction, so as not to take any unnecessary risks, as our boats operating in the southern areas could have mistaken us for the enemy when we met them. On January 14th, we received a report on the results of the photo reconnaissance conducted by our aviation on January 9th. As it turned out, on that day in the harbor of Guam was still anchored one enemy aircraft carrier, and the thought that he could have left before the attack of manned torpedoes filled my soul with a sense of deep regret. Until January 15th, we surfaced only at night. we had no encounters with the enemy. Submarines that failed to release manned torpedoes before January 14th were ordered to return to base. January 16th, I sent the following report to the command. The attack was made on January 12th, according to the plan. All torpedoes fired. The results of the attack could not be established. This was the first report transmitted by radio since we left the base. That evening, the noise detectors detected a ship with a turbine launcher. The boat's torpedo tubes were prepared to fire, but the night was dark, and so firing at the oncoming ship would have been a blind firing. The noises meanwhile began to subside. Then we heard the noises of a new ship with a diesel propulsion system, but they soon subsided as well. By January 19th, we had gone pretty far north, so it got considerably colder. In the afternoon, we spotted an airplane and, to avoid an attack, made a dive. At the same time, it must be said that our radar station for detecting air targets was not operational. During the night of January 20th, a ship was spotted near the entrance to the Bungo Strait with the help of the radar station for detecting surface targets. While we were determining its course, a submarine appeared on the horizon. It was night time and there was a light fog on the sea, which reduced visibility. The submarine that showed up looked a lot like the I-36. We gave our call signs, but she did not answer them. The unidentified boat had the advantage in course and soon disappeared from sight. After arriving at the base, we made inquiries. It turned out that we had indeed detected the submarine I-36 at that time, but she had not spotted us. What were the results achieved by other boats of the Congo detachment? Submarine I-56 headed for the Admiralty Islands, but after making 3 attempts to approach the place of release of manned torpedoes, found that the defense of the islands was too strong. Having failed to release torpedoes, this boat was forced to return to base. The submarine I-47 on January 11th safely penetrated the entrance to Hollandia Bay. She entered the bay just as the patrol ship was practicing training firing. The boat began firing manned torpedoes the next day at 4 a.m. at half-hour intervals. During the day, it was possible to intercept the work of the radio station, transmitting several radiograms in succession, from which it was possible to judge that it was about submarine attacks or their detection. Boat I-47 lay on a reverse course, no doubt about the success of the attack. The submarine I-53 headed for Coastal Passage off Palau Island. Arriving at her destination, she was unable to fire one of her human torpedoes due to a malfunction. The other torpedo had a pipe burst after detaching from the submarine and exploded. The remaining 2 torpedoes were safely fired, but the results of their attack remained unknown. As for the submarine I-36, she had already taken part in similar actions off Ulithi Islands for the second time. This time the boat approached the islands from the opposite side. During the approach, she slightly touched the hull of the reef, but was not damaged. Manned torpedoes were safely fired from the boat, but it was not possible to clarify the results of this attack. The submarine I-48 was to attack the enemy off Ulithi Islands on January 20th. It is believed that she managed to release manned torpedoes, but the boat itself did not return to the base. After the war, we learned that the boat I-48 was sunk by American destroyers near Ulithi Islands on January 22nd. A total of 14 manned torpedoes were fired by the Congo squadron boats. 10 torpedoes were not fired due to various malfunctions. As for the results of the attacks, they were not clarified even after the war. However, according to US data, manned torpedoes fired from the submarine I-58 in Guam sank a large tanker, on which most of the crew died. Poor performance of radar stations installed on the boats to detect air targets led to the creation of an 8-section antenna.